So in this video, I have a very important update in a major case against a statewide ban on the possession of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds and also a mandatory permit that was put in place. So let's talk about what is happening. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to protecting yourself in a self-defense incident, AOR is in a league of its own. But right now, AOR is actually doing something amazing. They've added even more benefits to their plan. Some of their new perks include civil liability coverage up to $100,000, red flag law coverage up to $15,000, and expungement coverage up to $5,000. They created a new association so they can give you this best self-defense coverage on the market. So again, check them out using the links down below. And if you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off your individual sign-up plan or $25 off of the family plan. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a challenge against a state magazine ban and their permit to purchase. Now, Oregon Measure 114 put in place a statewide permit to purchase and also a magazine ban, but that was ruled unconstitutional and struck down in its entirety by a state court. The state court judge in this case issued a permanent injunction against that Measure 114. The state of Oregon, in response, attempted to remove that permanent injunction through the appeals process. Well, recently, the Oregon Court of Appeals issued a unanimous order upholding the magazine ban and also upholding the permit process. That decision went against the permanent injunction, but in this case, currently the permanent injunction is still in place because this has been elevated to the Oregon State Supreme Court, who is now asked to step in and review this issue. Currently, the state of Oregon is arguing that the state Supreme Court should deny review of this case and allow Measure 114 and its permit process and magazine ban to go into effect immediately. Now, the case we're going to be focusing on in this video is called Arnold versus Kotek. This case challenges Oregon Measure 114 as a violation of the Oregon State Constitution. Measure 114 first requires that anyone purchasing a firearm within the state must obtain a permit to purchase. The second significant thing that it does, like I mentioned, is it creates a ban on the sale, purchase, transfer, and possession of any magazines that hold more than 10 rounds after the effective date of the measure. In response to the measure, Arnold versus Kotek was filed in a state court. Judge Robert Rossio ruled in this case that the Oregon Measure 114 was invalid under the state's constitution and must be struck down in its entirety with a permanent injunction. But of course, the story does not end there. The state of Oregon then appealed to the Court of Appeals there in the state, and they asked the Oregon Court of Appeals to reverse the permanent injunction issued by Judge Rossio and allow Measure 114 to go into place. Now, it's important to note that since this is a state court challenge under the Oregon State Constitution, there is a little bit different standard of review when it comes to the state court challenge and the constitutionality under the state law. In this case, there is the state of Oregon standard where they apply kind of a two-phase test. Under phase one, there is a determination of whether Article 1, Section 27 of the state constitution actually applies. Under the first phase of the step there, Oregon argues that Article 1, Section 27 does not apply since they believe these magazines are not arms and they're not protected by the state constitution. Now, the second phase of the test is almost looking at the public's interest in balancing the claimed purpose with the potential of undue burden, essentially impacts on the constitutional right to purchase and possess these types of arms. Of course, Oregon in the Measure 114 argues that the measure is in the public's best interest to stop crime. However, the trial court found through the expert testimony and data that was presented to him that the public harms were kind of overblown and that the measure does absolutely nothing to meet those claimed interests. This case eventually made its way to the Court of Appeals, and my prediction after listening to the oral arguments in front of the Court of Appeals was that the court there wanted to reverse the decision by Judge Rossio. They held that all of ballot Measure 114 is facially valid under Article 1, Section 27 because the law is capable of some constitutional applications. The Court of Appeals stated that from the foregoing, the question we must address in this case is whether the enacting body here, the people of Oregon, enacted a reasonable regulation governing the possession and use of constitutionally protected arms in order to promote public safety without unduly frustrating the right of armed self-defense. When it came to the permits process, they stated that the permit to purchase program and point of transfer background check reflect a contemporary legislative response to identifiable threats to public safety and a legislative determination that the risk of death or serious injury to members of the public is increased by the threat posed by untrained and dangerous persons obtaining firearms. Therefore, they upheld the permit process as constitutional. Now, on review of the magazine restriction, the State Court of Appeals stated that We also observe that the magazine ban is a contemporary legislative response to identified public safety concerns stemming from the advancements in technology and the availability of those advancements to the public that have created observable threats to public safety. So unfortunately, the Court of Appeals upheld the magazine ban and also the permit process under Measure 114. Now, this is not surprising since it seemed clear from the oral arguments that that is what they wanted to do. In response to that, the plaintiffs here have now filed for Supreme Court review in the state of Oregon, but the state of Oregon is currently opposing that review. In Oregon's recent brief opposing Supreme Court review, they put kind of little effort into the right to bear arms issue. They pretty much said that they agree with the Court of Appeals, of course, that the Court of Appeals didn't have to look at any of the fact findings that were established by Judge Rossio when he reviewed this case. They believed that the larger Second Amendment context of the federal issues, under Bruin, and those type of constitutional analysis don't play at all here when it comes to the state of Oregon, and that essentially all the Court of Appeals had to rely on was the reasonableness standard. They argued that since this was reasonable in some of its application and it was a reasonable restriction, and that maybe you still had access to some magazines and you still could get access to firearms even though you had to go through a permit and a background check and all of that, they said that that was reasonable enough. It was a reasonable restriction and therefore it aligns with the Oregon state constitution. In the Oregon brief, they focused on the fact that citizens in Oregon voted in favor of the measure and that the Supreme Court here of Oregon should allow the measure to go into effect as soon as possible to meet the voters' actual desires that they put in place with Measure 114. They state in the brief that, moreover, until the appellate judgment issues, enforcement of the law will remain stayed under the trial court's erroneous injunction, which has now delayed the law's enforcement for 2.5 years and counting. This court should deny review so that the people of Oregon's permissible legislative policy judgment can finally take effect. Now, it's important to note that there really is no timeline for the state Supreme Court to actually grant review to this issue. They could kind of sit on this for as long as they want, but even if they do sit on this, the block on the permit and the magazine ban that was issued by Judge Rossio will remain in place. So that might push the state Supreme Court to actually, step in sooner rather than later because, the longer they sit on this, more blocks that, that are going to happen here. That block is going to remain in place. Measure 114 won't go into effect. And that's also what the state of Oregon is saying, step in fast, let this go into effect immediately, deny review. But ultimately, also what could happen is even if the Oregon State Supreme Court denies review to this case, that then clears the road to go to the United States Supreme Court for review. Now, there needs to be at least 3 out of the 7 judges on the Supreme Court here in Oregon to grant review to this case, so that's also a strong possibility. And, the Oregon State Supreme Court has denied the state of Oregon's multiple attempts to override some of the Pro 2A decisions that were issued by Judge Rossio, so maybe that's another positive sign that there are enough judges on the Oregon State Supreme Court that don't agree with Measure 114. I will note it's kind of an uphill battle because of some of the liberal makeup in the state of Oregon. But, this is one of those very critical issues. It's impacting an entire state, the ability to acquire magazines, a permit process that is put in place to acquire firearms. And if Measure 114 is allowed to go into place, it's going to impact a lot of people and their right to keep and bear arms. So an unfortunate decision that was issued by the Oregon Court of Appeals, but now this is from the Oregon State Supreme Court, and hopefully they step in and do the right thing. I want to give a big shout out to the attorney here who was representing gun owners in Oregon in this specific lawsuit. Tony Aleo, I think is his last name. He's the attorney in this case. I highly recommend that you guys donate to the lawsuit efforts. I will leave a link to it down below in the comment section, pinned in the comment section. If you guys want to support this lawsuit, and especially if you're in the state of Oregon, you should be, donating to this effort because this is one of those critical cases that is currently blocking that magazine ban and the permit process. So now we're going to wait to see what the Oregon State Supreme Court says, and as we get more information as it develops, I will let you guys know. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.